Okay, now we get to the fun stuff. Okay, it's not fun at all, but it is my area of specialty. So I'm going to do my best to keep this video under 30 minutes, even though I know the rest have been quite short. I might even cut it into two sections. So we're going to start by just explaining what white collar crime is. Crimes committed by people of high social position in the course of his or her occupation, meaning they are doing something while they are at work and they have a high social position. They don't have to be rich, but they have to be respected. So we're going to look at some examples of this. But the point is, with most white collar crimes and most white collar criminals, they never get held accountable. So white collar criminals are able to use their powerful offices to illegally enrich themselves or harm others. It's not always about money. A lot of the times the book will say it's about money. All the time, it's not correct. It usually involves money in some way, shape, or form, but sometimes it is just power. And this causes considerable harm throughout society, even though we rarely ever talk about it. When I say the term crime, most people immediately think of street crime because that is what they see on Channel 2 News or CNN or Fox or whatever it is that they watch. It's the news that we constantly hear about. While white collar crime, although it may be discussed, sometimes it never has the kind of accountability or outcomes where people end up in prison, at least very rarely. And we'll talk about the few rare cases that does occur. Uh, Let me go ahead and make this full screen for now. So white collar offenses typically end up in a civil hearing rather than in a criminal courtroom. The difference between civil law and criminal law, or civil court and criminal court, all depends on whether it's an individual or a business. But even in the individual aspect, criminal law is only focused on things that are against the law, as we talked about how breaking a law is what crime is, but also is going to really just have an effect on like a jury will be involved, whereas civil law is more where it is about money. Nobody's going to go to prison, nobody's going to go to jail. The most accountability that's going to be held in a civil court is going to be about a settlement or money or even property. If you've ever turned on Channel 2, especially now since you guys are home, and you see, Judge Judy or one of those judge shows, that is an example of civil law. It's not really civil law or civil court, it's actually called mediation, but it is the example that they use as a form, or at least what we see the most when we talk about civil courts. Somebody may be found not guilty by a court of law in the criminal court system, but then be found guilty in a settlement or be held responsible in a civil court. That is what we saw happen with O.J. Simpson, who was not found guilty of the murder of his ex-wife and her friend, but then was found held accountable in a civil court. Now, in a civil court, there's less. It's not about be found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. There can still be reasonable doubt, but if the evidence points that way, even with that reasonable doubt, please ignore my bird, who is in the other room, by the way, and is still loud. Um, Let me try that again. With criminal court is where you have to be found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Civil court, you can have doubt, but if the evidence points that way, it's generally up to a judge, sometimes a jury. Um, but that's the difference between the two. If you were found guilty in a civil court, you're going to have to pay money. You're going to have to give up land, but you're not going to go to prison. All right. Other types of white collar crime before we get into the three specific types we're going to discuss can be embezzlement, false advertising, tax evasion, insider stock trading, fraud, pyramid schemes, things like that. In the 1980s, armed robbers netted about 400 million in the entire decade, but one scandal, and there was way more than one scandal through the 80s. One scandal, the savings and loan scandal, which was discussed on Where to Invade Next, if you recall, when Iceland talked about hiring Jack Black, and then he changed the name, but the lawyer from the U.S. to help with their global crisis from the global recession. They hired one of the American prosecutors that was able to get some money back from the savings and loan scandal in 1986. We're still paying on that scandal because when a scandal like that occurs or a bailout occurs, like in 2009 with the banks or 2008 with the banks, We pay that's where it comes from, our taxpayer dollars. So you've got 500, 600 million. We will still be paying on the savings and loan scandal for another year or two, and then we'll start paying on the 2008 bailouts. So these are the three types that we're going to go over. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing full screen. Um, and I'm going to give you examples of each one of these. So we're going to, state crime is any illegal actions of a government. So when we talk about state in the term of understanding how the word state is when it has a capital S, we're talking about a nation state. If we were to say the state of Illinois, that would be a lowercase s. That's the difference between the two. So state crime is the crime committed by government. Corporate crime is the crime committed by a corporation or by people on that corporation's behalf. And state corporate crime, which is where a lot of my studies were, is kind of a mixture of the two. So, well, it's not kind of, it is. There's two ways it can work. Either the corporation works with the government to commit the crime, or the corporation commits the crime and the government knows it's occurring but does not do anything to stop it. That's what the bottom there says, omission or commission. That's what it means. Omission means they just ignored the fact that this crime was occurring and people were killed. Commission means they were actively involved in this crime themselves. So we're going to start. Um, I guess I don't need to start a new video. This is where we'll spend a little bit of time. Okay, so I'm going to start with state crime. Remember, crimes committed by a government. And we're going to talk about two very specific cases. Let me get everything set up here. Again, please be patient. I'm sorry. So the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, normally I would ask how many of you have heard of this. I can't do that here, but is a crime that was committed by the United States government from 1932 until 1972. This was an experiment that was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service to study the natural progression of untreated syphilis in poor rural black men who thought they were receiving free health care. There were 600 men in total. 399 of them already had syphilis, but 201 of them were infected for the purpose of the study by the government. Now, I don't know how much you know about syphilis, but it is a horrifying STD that causes there to become holes in your brain. And it causes people who are untreated to basically go psychotic, lose their mind in some very horrible ways. And this went on for 40 years without anybody ever telling these men that they had syphilis, which meant that they passed it on to their wives or their girlfriends or their boyfriends or their children, and then their children pass it on to the same thing. And we constantly see it go down that way because it is a highly infectious STD. And it doesn't have to just be through sexual transmission, it can be through birth. So there were a lot of people who, outside of just these 600 individuals, who were then affected by this experiment. It was secret from 1932 until 1972. In the early 1940s, it was found that penicillin could treat STDs, not just STDs, I'm sorry, but syphilis. But the government decided not to use that because, quote, the purpose of the study was to see how untreated syphilis played out in these men. Again, these men were poor. They had no health care. They were black during Jim Crow era America, which we'll get to in chapter 8. They had no chances of getting decent jobs. So they were doing anything they could to get health care for their family, and that's what they were being promised here. But they didn't know that they had any kind of disease, especially the 2001 that were, the 201 that were infected with it. In 1972, a whistleblower brought the story to mainstream and published it, I think, in the Wall Street Journal. Let me check, actually, because I can do that now. Please ignore the bird. Okay, I'm back. Sorry. I had to put a blanket over the bird to be quiet. I'm trying here, guys. All right, so I was in the middle of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. In 1972, it wasn't the Wall Street Journal, it was the Washington Star that broke the story. This was after almost 7 years of a whistleblower trying to bring this to people's attention so it would stop. His name was Peter Buxton, was the whistleblower, and it immediately became front page news once the Washington Star grabbed a hold of it. And then it followed on the New York Times, and this actually led to the end of the study. So it went on for 40 years. The men were originally told it would only last 6 months, but after that, it took until 1997 until President, it was Bill Clinton, finally apologized to these men. But most of them were dead at that point. But these families had no recourse. As recently as 2014, family members were in court trying to get any kind of health care to help with what the government had done to their families and themselves because they still had the disease, of course, as well. So that's an example of a government who exposed their most vulnerable to a horrible disease and then never even told them about it. That is definitely a state crime. There are a lot of different state crimes. I am limiting here to what I'm going to talk about for different reasons. I teach entire classes on crime and deviance and talk more about it in those types of classes. The only other one I'll bring up really is just the fact that government surveillance is a form of state crime as well. You're going to watch a video after this chapter that's going to talk a little bit about that. But it's important to understand that when the government goes against the Constitution or breaks laws, whether or not people care or not isn't really the matter, as much as the fact that it is illegal and it is state crime. So those are the two main examples that I'm going to use there. And then I'm going to move to corporate crime now. So corporate crime is where the crime is committed by a corporation, either trying to hide a mistake so they don't have to pay money to fix it or just to get more money. Sadly, what you'll learn over, especially the next chapter as well, is a lot of capitalism, at least in the United States, is focused on profits over people's safety. And that's where you can really see state crime and corporate crime come together with state corporate crime. So the first case we're going to look at is what is known as the Ford Pinto case. This is probably one of the most famous scandals in American history with corporations. Now, I was going to bring up a Ford Pinto. I want to show you how small they are. Might help if there we go. Hey, there's the NCBS again. You can see I'm doing this all at the same time. Ford Pinto. Nope, I don't need a scandal. I know that. There you go. This is what a Ford Pinto looked like. It says misunderstood cars. Dear God. Um, so the biggest issue with the Ford Pinto was that the gas tank on the other side, here we go, the gas tank was too close, if you look over here to the right there, to the bumper. And what happened catastrophically was that the Pinto was rushed to market in 1972. Um, the gas tank would rupture in any kind of collision, even if you were just backing up and you accidentally hit a mailbox. The car would explode, and that it was completely illegal. You couldn't have something that bad and that close to explosion be on the market even in 1972. And this went from 1972 until 1980. Um, Between 500 and 900 people were killed from a Ford Pinto explosion. It is hard to get the exact amount because some people may have died in any situation if the car would have caught on fire. But the biggest problem is just the fact that a lot of times when a car ends in a fire, that's just considered an accident and they don't look into it in much more detail to see what may have caused that accident. So it's one thing, people, not just people, but corporations make mistakes and then they make recalls, right? And that's not necessarily a crime. Mistakes happen, we expect them to occur. But here's where Pinto and, well, where Ford changes and how this becomes a state crime instead of just an accident. There were internal documents from Ford to their investors that showed that Ford secretly crash tested the Pinto more than 40 times before it went to the market in 1972 and even multiple years after that. And every single time, it showed that the Pinto would explode. So they knew this was occurring and they still put the car out to production and for people to purchase. that's when it becomes a crime. That is entirely illegal. The only reason we found out about it again was a whistleblower who leaked those internal documents to the press. And within those internal documents, it even said where Ford said, yes, we know this is occurring. They're talking to their investors, but that it would cost more. They thought they could save more money if they just paid off the families of the victims of those who died instead of actually doing the $7 recall on every car. So it shows that they knew what was happening. It shows that they could have fixed it. They could have stopped the deaths, and that's how it falls into corporate crime. Now, Ford did this again in 1996. It's called the Ford Firestone case. I know it's not on there, but it's almost exactly the same. The difference being that it wasn't just Ford, it was also Firestone Tires, which is a different corporation. And they caused 271 deaths because the tread on the tires were separating due to faulty material that was used. And Ford again gets caught using internal documents showing that they knew this was occurring and almost verbatim saying the same thing, that they would rather pay off the victims of those who have died than to do the $12 fix, which would actually have been split between them and Firestone, so it would have been $6 each. They continued to blame consumers for years, and it took until at least 19, it took about 3 years for any case to actually make it to the courts. And they did have to pay out. It's usually just a slap on the wrist. That's what you're going to find with corporate crimes and state corporate crimes. Even if there is, if they do get caught, if they do get in trouble, they get a slap on the wrist, and that's it. Toyota, very similar, the 2010 accelerator scandal. It was between 2009 and 2010. At least 89 people were killed. It was way more than that, but we don't have the exact figures again because when accidents happen, they don't necessarily go in to try to figure out what happened. They always usually blame the driver or whoever else caused the accident, not the car itself. Um, to this day, Toyota has tried to kind of scrape the internet of any information and blame this all on consumers. I've seen the Wikipedia the page changed multiple times, and it goes back and forth between the facts that come from the case and then, of course, Toyota going in and changing it. We see this with a lot of things. It's not just Toyota. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment Wikipedia pages changes regularly. They try to say that the government never gave them syphilis, when in reality we have the documents that show that they did. So you always are going to have what they're called their shills, and it's their job to go on the internet and to try to change people's opinions, to have a positive opinion of these corporations when they have done some pretty bad things. So with Toyota, it was the unintended acceleration. The pedal would get stuck. The acceleration pedal would get stuck, and people would not be able to stop their cars, and they'd be going 50, 60, 70 on the highway, and they wouldn't be able to stop, and they would crash and die. And Toyota knew about this. Again, internal documents show that they knew about this, but they refused to do anything about it. They didn't do any recalls. And it finally gained attention when a family was driving, I'm not sure where, and it was a father, a mother, and a young daughter. I remember it very well. I cannot find this video, but I remember when it occurred live on air because the father had called CNN to tell them what was happening, or they had called 911 and they leaked it to CNN. I'm sorry, they had called 911 and they died on the phone, and that was leaked to CNN so that they would finally so that people would know. And then Toyota finally started doing recalls. Um, Now, they wanted to blame it on driver error, but the issue was that every single death that happened in the United States, and Toyota is a worldwide corporation. So if it was only in the US, that means that there was the production here in the United States, there was faulty accelerator pedals. There weren't anywhere else in any other production. So we know that it's not just driver error. Then you have the Nestle baby formula scandal, which is really just depressing as hell. To break it down, so Nestle, make Nestle quick. They control most of our water today. In the 1970s, because Nestle also does baby formula, they had produced baby formula and started giving it out to free at hospital centers and triage in the poorest nations in the world, mostly in Africa. And so they would find these poor mothers, and they would, as soon as they would give birth, they would give them access to baby formula because they would say it would be more nutritious than their breast milk, since they don't have a lot of nutrition in their diet, since they were incredibly impoverished. But then what would happen is, and this went on for years, they would wait until the mother left the hospital and still give her free baby formula until her breast milk dried up. And then they would say, now you have to pay for it. and hundreds of babies died because these are the poorest people in the world, and there was no way they could pay for it. And in Nestle's internal documents, they said mothers will always find a way, but there was no way for these women to pay for this, and so their babies starved to death. There's been a boycott of Nestle ever since then, but I'm sure most of you have not heard about it. It is not something that is discussed, even though it absolutely should be. But there you go. And then you have the Bayer blood scandal. Oh, so even after I had been studying white collar crime and state crime and corporate crime for 15 years, I had not heard about the Bayer blood scandal until about 4 years ago, which I find very interesting because it happened in the 70s and in the 80s. And meaning that it was not in the literature. Nobody ever talked about it. I mean, the Nestle's baby formula scandal is in the literature when you study white collar crime. The Toyota, of course, happened while I was a professor and already in the research. The Ford Pinto scandal is a classic white collar crime. So I heard about all these, but I hadn't heard about Bayer until I met somebody who was affected by it. Now, it didn't happen in the United States. That might be why we didn't hear much about it. But usually it's just because Bayer is such a powerful company that they are able to keep themselves protected within the media. Okay, so let me break this down. So Bayer knowingly sold blood clotting agents infected with HIV around the world. Originally, what they had done is during like blood donation, you're not allowed to take blood, of course, from people who have certain blood disorders or HIV or anything like that. But this is very early on in HIV's discovery. And so originally, it was hepatitis, is what was found in the blood in the 1970s, late 1970s. And the United States banned Bayer from giving patients that the blood was collected for hemophiliacs, so people who need blood transfusions pretty regularly. And Bayer would sell that to hospitals, and then the hospitals would then use it to give to their patients. But the blood had hepatitis in it. So then the people that were given these blood transfusions who were already sick were then sickened even more with hepatitis. Well, the United States then banned Bayer from using any of their blood in our patients because it was making people sick. At that point, this was 1982, in Atlanta, Georgia, HIV was being detected in the patients in America that had been given that blood as well. And I cannot explain to you the AIDS epidemic of the early 80s and the fear. It's actually very similar to what we're going through now, but in a different phase because of a different situation. But it was still the kind of fear that went along with it. So, although the US banned Bayer, Bayer decided to just take their blood and go elsewhere. So, they gave it to the UK, Asia, Latin America, months after withdrawing it from the United States. First, they went to Europe, of course, and gave the blood there. I can give you just some numbers of how many people, how many hemophiliacs were contaminated with these products, and these are between the 70s and 1985. 10,000 people in the U.S. were infected with HIV from Bayer's blood, 2,000 people in Canada with HIV, 60,000 people in Canada with hepatitis C, 4,000 people in France, hundreds of people in Iran and Iraq, 1,300 people died in Italy from the HIV that they were infected with, 150 of them children. Now, Italy was the only one that actually did a kind of, I wouldn't say research, it was like a criminal court trial into understanding how many people were affected. That's why we have the exact number of deaths there. The UK also opened up an investigation, but they never did. They still haven't like concluded it, even though it started in 1985. And in the UK, 4,000 people were infected with hepatitis C, and 1,200 at least were affected with HIV. 1,400 people were infected in Japan with HIV, and so on. So they knowingly, that's the big thing to understand here, knowingly infected tens of thousands of people with HIV and hepatitis C, and literally nothing has ever happened to them for that. They were not punished, they were not fined. The only thing that was happening is they couldn't use their blood in the countries once it was found out. That is the perfect example of corporate crime and the perfect example of the power that a company can have um, and not be held accountable for killing people. Just as we saw with Ford and Toyota, they may have been hit by unpopular opinion at the time, but we didn't have the social media we have today, so most people didn't even hear about it. That's the end of this video because it is pretty long already. I'm going to come back and do a short video on state court. It's not going to be short on state corporate crime.